Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar, Using International Data Trends to Get Ahead of the Curve. My name is Ben van Tongeren and I'm the Director of Customer Success for Lightcast here in APAC, and I'm delighted to be presenting this webinar to you today. I'm joined by our VP of Operations for APAC, Daniel Ledbetter. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please put them in the questions box in the GoToMeeting control panel and we'll endeavour to get to those at the end of the presentation. We'll be sharing the recording and slides for today in a follow-up email, so please keep your eyes open for that also. We have a bit to cover off today, but we hope to send you off a little early to give you some time to grab a coffee or get on top of your inbox. The presentation will be about 30 to 40 minutes, and as I said, we'll keep some time open for questions at the end as well. We appreciate you taking the time to be here and hope the information provided today provokes some thought and insight into the data we produce at Lightcast to illuminate the labour market and allow organisations like yours to navigate trends and make data-driven decisions in curriculum design, career services, marketing, workforce planning, and more. In today's webinar, we'll be looking at our global labour market data and exploring skill trends from geographies outside of APAC and comparing that data to what we're seeing domestically. We'll start by briefly discussing our data, what it is, how we get it, and what we do with it. From there, we'll start to look at how occupation trends can be observed through both occupational taxonomies like ANSCO, SSOC, ONET, and our own Lightcast occupational taxonomy or LOT, and how we can see a more nuanced view of the market using skills data. From there, we've selected two occupations with high skill change and taken a close look at some of the notable skill trends within those roles. We'll look at these occupations from both a domestic and global viewpoint and see what trends we can identify from movements offshore. We'll then look at the emergence and movement of green skills and see what lessons we can learn from a more global perspective. The intent today is to observe what's happening in both of these use cases and then discuss how we in APAC can benefit from insights from these offshore trends. I know there's a number of our wonderful clients with us here today. Welcome, glad to have you. And that this won't be entirely new to you, but for the benefit of those who aren't current clients, I'll briefly explain Lightcast's offering. Lightcast data is generated from job postings data globally, collected from over 51,000 sources, job boards, company websites, and staffing agencies, etc. Our data in APAC goes back to 2012, which allows us to observe changes in occupations and skills over time, creating a real-time portrait of labour market demand and allowing us to enhance data literacy and gain insights into the labour market. Ultimately, it allows us to identify and track important labour market trends as they happen. Once we've collected our postings, we then distill the data, removing up to 80% of what we collect, taking out duplicates, scam postings, and anything else that isn't relevant. Our software then extracts top-line information about each job, such as title, employer, and industry, and then we code out more specific data points like job titles, skills, qualifications, pay scale, and more. Finally, we provision this data via software, data feeds, or APIs. So let's start today by talking about skills and why they're important. Skills are vital when observing the labour market because they influence employability, competitiveness, and economic growth. Understanding the skills and demand helps governments, educators, job seekers, and employers make informed decisions and adapt to the evolving dynamics of the labour market. We often make the mistake of focusing on occupations and not the skills that underpin them. While occupations remain important for understanding the structure and categorization of jobs, skills provide a more granular and adaptable perspective that can better reflect the evolving nature of work. Prioritizing skills allows us to more effectively enhance employability, adapt to industry change, and make informed decisions about careers. The nature of work is evolving rapidly due to technological advancements, automation, and shifts in industry demands. Job roles and occupations are constantly being redefined, and new roles are emerging. Skills, on the other hand, capture the specific abilities and knowledge required to perform tasks across different occupations. Skills are transferable across occupations, meaning that they can be applied in various job roles and industries. Emphasizing skills allows employees to showcase their versatile capabilities, making them more attractive to employers. For example, skills such as problem solving, communication, and project management are valued in multiple professions and can be utilized in different contexts. Skills are certainly a global challenge. In Europe in 2022, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, confirmed 2023 as the European Year of Skills. The challenges that were recognised were that more than 75% of companies across Europe were not able to find workers with the necessary skills to be effective in their roles. Further to that, only 37% of adults were undertaking ongoing training, and 40% of adults were identified as lacking digital skills. Despite the Year of Skills being an EU initiative, skill gaps are common across many countries, and the issues the European Commission is looking to address are applicable elsewhere. For instance, in the UK, Brexit made it even more challenging to retain immigrants, leading to an estimated shortfall of 330,000 workers, a shortage that continues to pose challenges to employers. In Australia, there's a desperate need to fill in skills gaps too. So much so that the Australian government is now offering apprentices $5,000 to study sought-after skills by taking one of the occupations from the Australian Apprenticeships Priority List. 30 new occupations were recently added, making a total of 111 occupations where that bonus is applicable. In Singapore, Skills Future Singapore, SSG, released a research paper, Skills Demand for the Future Economy, in which it was identified that demand for skills in the green infrastructure and mobility grew almost 200% from 2018 to 21. And skills in software development have the highest demand growth, particularly in cloud systems and infrastructure domain. Skills are certainly an area of focus for us here at Lightcast as well. In a recent study in partnership with the Burning Glass Institute and the Boston Consulting Group called Shifting Skills, Moving Targets, and Remaking the Workforce, it was identified that the skills underlying the average job changed 37% between 2016 and 2021. In this study, we built what we've called a Skill Disruption Index. The index allows us to compare how rapid and significant the changes are in specific roles. It combines two measures, the emergence of new skills and the change in the importance of skills. All of this is plotted on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being the least amount of disruption. In reviewing the 5-year data, we found an acceleration in the pace of change. Nearly 3/4 of jobs changed more between 2019 and 21 than they did between 2016 and 2018. In the top quartile of occupations, the 25% of jobs with the highest skill disruption indices, we saw the most dramatic change. Almost 80% of the top 20 skills are either new or have increased or decreased in importance. Most of us understand that skills are an important lens when observing labour market movements. There's a lot of noise here, and it can be difficult to navigate and explore these trends without real-time insight. How can educators, employers, and workers keep up with that pace of change? In a tight and complex job market, understanding trends and skill change is vital for staying competitive and getting ahead. That's where Lightcast can help. Our data can help cut through that noise and provide valuable insight into these skill trends. So, let's look at what Lightcast Global Labour Market data can tell us. In this webinar, we're going to look at two popular occupations, graphic designers and software engineers. We've chosen these roles as they appear high on our list in the Skills Disruption Report, and they incorporate a range of skill types. In both occupations industries, we see a notable increase in the share of top 20 skills requested in the 2016 to 21 period. We'll look at the skill movement for these occupations in ANZ and compare these to the United States. We've found that observing trends in the United States allows us to understand what's happening in these occupations from an offshore perspective and can give us an indication of what trends might be making their way to our shores. It's often said the US leads the world in many ways, and in this case, we use US data as a proxy for the measure of skill demand. We don't necessarily need to be looking offshore, but it does allow us a longer runway to observe potentially incoming trends. We start today by looking at the occupation of software engineer. This occupation scored very highly in our Skills Disruption Index and requires skill sets that rapidly evolve within a highly technical field. Software engineers need to understand programming languages, frameworks, algorithms, data structures, and more, but they also need skills that allow them to design, develop, and maintain software systems effectively. Software programming is often a collaborative effort, with engineers working in teams to build and maintain complex systems. So it goes without saying that project management skills, communication, and collaboration are also critical skills for software engineers wanting to excel in their roles. As we observe the changing nature of skills, few jobs are influenced more than software developers as they continue to adapt to the latest trends, tools, and methodologies. In this chart, we see a curated collection of specialized skills required for software engineers. ANZ data is represented by the blue lines, the first of which represents postings data from 2021 and the second from 2022. The orange bars represent the same time periods, but with US data. What we can see here is that there are notable demand increases in many skills within this category in both regions. There's a lot of data here, so let's focus more closely on some examples of skills that show interesting trends. Project management skills are highly desired for software engineers, and we've selected 3 skills from our specialized skills list to focus on. Firstly, agile development. It's clearly highly desired in the US, represented in over 30% of job postings in 2022 and growing in demand in both regions. This suggests that in the US, it is highly valuable for software developers to have skills completing project on time, within budget, with strong communication channels between development teams and project owners. Scrum is also growing in demand in both regions, suggesting this skill is here to stay and should certainly be an area of focus for individuals in the industry and educators in this space. Scalability has grown immensely in demand in both regions, representing the growing need for technology organizations and employees to be prepared for growing amounts of work and growing demands on infrastructure. Now, what happens if we extend this observation to a longer time period? In this chart, we take a closer look at Scrum skills for software developers over a much longer timeline, in this case from 2012 to 2022. When we look at the data from this perspective, we can start to see some interesting trends emerge. Firstly, the US was certainly quick off the mark adopting this methodology. We see a clear incline in demand from 2012, and that trend continues for the following 10 years. ANZ started seeing an increase in demand for Scrum skills in 2014. This is the first example we see where a trend in the US is found to also occur domestically, but in this case, about 2 years behind. In this and some of the following data visualizations, you'll also notice a very obvious decline in demand in ANZ around 2019, and that can be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic, where our workforces were heavily affected and then returned to normal rates. We do see clear growth in demand in region from that period on in ANZ, and we've all but equaled the US in demand for this skill as of last year. Demand for cloud skills are also growing notably in both ANZ and the US, particularly with occupations like software engineer. We do see a larger focus in AWS than its Microsoft counterpart Azure in the US. The inference we could derive here is that AWS is maintaining its dominance in the cloud-based infrastructure space, and employees and related industries are likely to find that employers desire these skills increasingly. Azure still maintains a stronger presence in ANZ, but will we see a similar trend emerge on our shores with AWS growth in the coming years? We also see a very high demand for DevOps skills within ANZ, which suggests that domestically our nations are focused on developing systems that require more efficient, fast and secure infrastructure and application development. The growth in the US of this skill set also suggests this is a trend that's likely to continue. Now let's take a closer look at DevOps skills over the 10-year period of 2012 to 22. DevOps skills align very well with our previous Scrum observations, as the skills are highly valued in combination. DevOps skills employ principles and practices that help manage complexity and development life cycles to ensure faster deployment of software changes and enhancements. Scrum as a methodology dovetails well into this dynamic process where changes need to be made in an efficient, structured and well communicated manner. There is clear demand for DevOps skills in both the US and ANZ. If we look at the line carefully, in the US in the 2016 to 17 period, we see DevOps skills almost doubling in demand. There is a market jump also in the ANZ region, but this time 4 years behind our American counterparts in 2021. This further reinforces that we can often observe demand change from the US ahead of time and its potential impact in our region if we look at the data closely. Continuing our exploration of DevOps skills, we see that across both regions, there are many roles that require this skill set. Highlighted here in the top 25 most frequent postings in both the US and ANZ. We start to see here that the skill is not just important for software engineers, but also a number of occupations that may not traditionally have required this skill set, such as IT managers, computer support specialists, product managers, Scrum masters, and industrial engineers. Now let's look at one of the core skills for software engineers, programming languages. Programming languages are evolving rapidly, and for employees and educators in this space, global trends are incredibly important. Educators need to be able to prepare their students for the languages they need now and in the future, and adapting curriculum to prepare emerging students is often an ongoing practice. Java, which was first created all the way back in 1995, is still the most requested programming language in both ANZ and the US, currently represented as a required skill in over 30% of US job postings for software engineers and around a quarter of roles in ANZ. It's increasing in demand in the US, however, we have seen a slight decrease in demand in ANZ. We see huge growth in Python demand in both regions, a 466% year-to-year increase in ANZ and 500% increase year-to-year in the US. We'll have a closer look at that shortly. SQL is a programming language originally designed for viewing and changing data stored in databases, and interestingly, it is in higher demand in ANZ than it is within the US, although both regions are showing demand growth. API programming, Git and C++ are in higher demand in the US, and maybe ones to keep an eye on domestically to see if that trend continues here. Let's zero in on Python. As I mentioned, we see strong demand growth in Python skills globally, and extending the viewpoint across a longer time span, we can see steady growth in demand from the US year on year and a slightly less consistent growth path for ANZ, with a large increase in the 2020 to 2022 period. During the 2014 to 18 period, we can see strong demand growth in the US. And again, we see the demand spike in ANZ occur notably later in 2021. If we were looking at this from an education or economic growth perspective, it'd be possible to observe the demand growth from the US and perhaps develop and train software engineers with those skills to ensure they were prepared with the future demands of their roles. As it stood in ANZ, our growth and demand stepped up in 2021 and looks to be increasingly sought after. As we did with DevOps skills, we can see that across both regions there are many roles that require Python skills. Again, we see here the top 25 occupations in both regions requesting the skill set. And again, we can see that the skill is not just important for software engineers, but other occupations that may not traditionally have required this skill set, such as researchers, industrial engineers, geographers, and statisticians. So we see here that there are a number of notable trends emerging from the US, and we can utilize this intelligence to make better data-driven decisions when optimizing product offerings and connecting students and future employees to programs, careers, and professional development. Software engineers operate in a highly technical environment. But what happens when we observe the data in a more creative type occupation? In this case, we turn to the occupation of graphic designer, which also featured highly in our skills disruption index and requires a pretty broad range of skills. Graphic designers today make use of their creative skills, but also need to be technically capable and capable of working as a team. Good communication skills, time management, attention to detail, and adaptability are all highly valued, but graphic design software skills are also incredibly important, as the data will demonstrate. One of the additional layers we add to our taxonomy is the categorization of skills into three key areas. Baseline skills, which are foundational skills found across industries and occupations. And we have specialized skills, which are more professional and occupation-specific skills, and software and programming skills, so specific computer skills, anywhere from Excel through to Python. For graphic designers across US and ANZ, we use these lenses to observe skill demand and trends. And what we find domestically is that graphic designers in ANZ require more creativity, teamwork, and organizational skills. While in the US, presentation skills, leadership, customer service, and self-motivation are in higher demand. So what inference can we take from this? Well, it could suggest that organizational structure in ANZ requires more team focus and more creative requirements as a graphic designer, as opposed to the US, where employees are perhaps more siloed in their roles and responsibilities. This could be due to the pure scale of operations in our respective regions. It's feasible that graphic designers in ANZ often operate within smaller organizations and boutique agencies, whereas in the US, marketing agencies can be much larger in scale and therefore have larger teams of employees with more specific roles and responsibilities. When we shift to specialized skills, so just as a reminder, they're the professional and occupation-specific skills, we see marketing, brand management, and sales skills feature really highly in the US. While in ANZ, graphic designers are asked to do much more design work and social media work. It's possible that graphic designers in the US are therefore encouraged or even expected to be more commercially minded, having to communicate the value of their work, both to internal and external stakeholders. For graphic designers, when it comes to software, the Adobe suite remains supreme. It is highly desired as a skill in the US and in ANZ. However, interestingly, we are seeing a small reduction in demand in the US, while there's steady growth domestically. HTML5, which is a markup language used for presenting web content, is growing in demand in ANZ and more frequently requested when compared to equivalent roles in the US. In fact, in the US, it's currently decreasing in demand. Interestingly, CSS is in much higher and increasing demand in the US, and as a tool that describes how HTML elements are displayed, it could be again that this speaks to the segmented nature of US graphic designer roles and the larger organizations that are potentially working with them. Broadening our Adobe skill demand observations, in this case to Photoshop, we do see some interesting trends. The familiar COVID demand makes an appearance here again in ANZ, but the US shows that they were largely immune to these impacts within their labour market. Looking closely, we can see the decrease in demand starts earlier in the US than the ANZ region, about 4 years later in 2016. The dip in demand in the US could very well be a movement towards other software solutions. But if this is the case, the experiment doesn't appear to be successful as they return to a normal level of demand a few years later. As we saw with Python and Scrum skills with software engineers, The US drop in demand was clear from 2012 through to 2017, but wasn't mirrored in ANZ until about 4 years later. With the slow but obvious decrease in Photoshop skill demand in the US since 2019, while ANZ slowly returns to a high demand point, it'll be interesting to see where these lines go in the coming years. The question we can ask here is, will we see a similar decrease onshore as observed in the US in the future? And what tools will take the place of Adobe, if any? It's certainly an area for educators, employers, and employees in the space to be following. Turning now to another popular tool in the Adobe suite, this time InDesign, we see similar patterns to that of Photoshop. There was significant growth in demand for Adobe InDesign skills in the US from 2017 to 2019, which wasn't seen on our shores until 2 years later. We see an almost identical line for ANZ in the last 6 years as we saw for Photoshop, and we also see the same slow demand decrease in the US. Further research here would be important to identify whether this reflects the changing nature of the graphic designer occupation, or whether the Adobe suite is meeting some viable competitors in the market. So what we've seen here is the changing demand for skills within two common occupations, and in many cases, a marked difference between demand in the US versus demand in ANZ. We've seen multiple examples of trends emerging in the US that have been replicated in ANZ, in some cases up to 4 years later. So if we utilize these insights, we can better structure solutions for workers training in these fields and prepare them more effectively for the skills that are going to be in demand, as opposed to the skills that they're traditionally taught. This provides a unique competitive advantage for educators and organizations by allowing them to make data-driven decisions regarding how they train and develop their students and workers. I'd now like to change direction and look into the emerging green skills environment, where we've seen immense change in the last few years and recognition from many countries that green skills are going to be increasingly desirable and in fact needed for future economic growth and environmental sustainability. We've heard much about the importance of working globally to face the challenges of climate change through mitigation, adaptation, and international cooperation. That's a lot of Asians. National governments around the world are recognizing the importance of putting strategies in place to mitigate the effects of climate change domestically and globally. The EU is attempting to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 as part of the European Green Deal. The UK announced similar plans in 2021 when the UK government published its net zero strategy Build Back Greener report, setting all the policies and strategies required to achieve net zero by 2050. Most recently, in October of last year, Australia and Singapore joined forces to sign the Singapore-Australia Green Economy Agreement, or GEA, defining the key activities to reduce emissions and drive growth in the sustainability space. Governments across the globe are moving towards establishing a green economy, but without data, some of these concepts can be too vague to be put into action. In Lightcast's 2023 report, The Global Talent Playbook, we saw demand for green jobs growing by over 50% since 2019. Globally, we've seen notable growth in green postings across many countries in the EU, with Germany producing the greatest demand for green jobs globally. With the EU net zero and emissions reductions effort, the boost in green jobs within that region is probably to be expected. So much has been said about the green economy, yet there's still no official definition of green. To understand the specifics of a green labour market, it's crucial to have a broad idea of what the term green encompasses and what it doesn't. Lightcast's job postings data enables you to understand how employers describe jobs, the green skills associated with those jobs, and helps you track the demand for those skills over time. Lightcast developed Green Jobs Now in collaboration with the US-based nonprofit Working Nation, in which we identified 4 different types of green jobs. These are core green jobs. These are the jobs that play a direct role in conserving the environment. So this includes solar engineers, hydroelectric engineers, and energy efficiency specialists. Then we have green enabled jobs. These are jobs that aren't directly connected to the green economy, but require increasingly more green skills. For example, HVAC installers adopting an energy efficient product, mechanics developing EV skills, and electricians evolving their skill set to cater for more alternative power sources such as solar. Then we have green enabling jobs. These are jobs that traditionally don't require green related skills, but are part of organizations linked to the green economy, such as marketing manager at a solar panel company. And finally, we have potential green jobs. These are jobs that currently have little relation to the green economy, but may evolve to require green skills in the future, such as maintenance techs and engineers. We actually see an interesting trend locally where early childhood teachers are now seeing a growth in demand for sustainability skills as it has become part of their evolving curriculum demands. Recently, Lightcast partnered with City and Guilds, also Engineering UK, and the National College for Nuclear in the UK to explore the changes within the energy industry's workforce. In this report, it was identified that one of the biggest challenges faced in the greening of skills in the UK was reskilling and retaining the people they need to accomplish the transition to a carbon neutral future. National Grid research from 2020 estimated that 400,000 roles would need to be filled by 2050 to build the workforce required in the UK to meet the increased demand for renewable energy production and their net zero targets. It's a big ask. As an example of the growth in demand for roles requiring low carbon skills from 2019 to 2022, it was observed that the number of unique job postings for renewable energy managers had rocketed by 1,144%. The chart on screen shows the fastest growing job titles in this sector, and these roles will continue to evolve in terms of their skill requirements as new technologies emerge and demand for green skills continues to grow. The research also indicated clearly that jobs in low carbon industries in the UK are set to skyrocket. 1,000 people working in the UK energy sector were surveyed, and 60% of those believe that many new jobs will be created in low carbon energy sectors such as wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, carbon capture and storage over the next 5 years. The change in opportunities are also thankfully translating into some optimism, with over half of those working in the energy industry feeling hopeful about the government's ambition to decarbonise the UK energy system by 2035, and a third feeling excited. If we take a core green job, in this case, renewable energy engineers, and observe recent skill demands, we can see a broad range of skills are required, including a mix of traditional energy engineer skills such as project management, project engineering, mechanical engineering and construction, and the green skills that wouldn't have existed before the awareness of climate change, such as renewable energy systems. We also see some technical skills rounding out these top skills as well, including Python, which, as we mentioned earlier, is growing in demand in a broad range of occupations globally. So let's look at one green skill in isolation: climate change. In this data set, we observe the period of 2016 through to 2022. And alongside trends in the ANZ and the US, as we did earlier, we also look at trends in the UK. What we can observe here is a clear increase in demand for climate change skills in all regions, with huge growth demand recently in the US. In that last period, from 2020 to 2022, we see a 293% increase in demand for climate change skills in ANZ, a 250% increase in demand in the UK, and a whopping 432% increase in the US. The acceleration of demand in the US in particular suggests that climate skill change demand is almost certain to increase in coming years across many occupations in many regions. Another interesting observation here is that the US climate change skill demand started increasing in 2018, but we didn't see a similar acceleration in the UK or ANZ until 2021, 3 years later. This further reinforces that if we observe what's happening in larger nations, we can utilize that insight to be better prepared for those potentially incoming trends domestically. Now let's take a wider view of green skills globally. In this chart, we've selected a range of green skills and tracked their collective demand over the same period. Looking at the recent time period of 2020 to 2022, we see an 108% increase in demand in the US for this collection of skills. We see 177% increase in demand in the UK and an 173% increase in ANZ. The last couple of years in particular are showing incredible growth in demand for green skills across all regions, after a notably flat 4-year period in ANZ and the UK. Again, the demand growth pattern emerges in the US initially in 2018, but it doesn't appear in ANZ and the UK until much later in 2021, further demonstrating how trends in the US tend to reach our region within time. Today, we've covered a number of topics, and we hope it's given you some insight into the changing nature of occupations and skills, and how data can provide the ability to better navigate changes within the labour market. We've only scratched the surface, but I hope you've found what we've uncovered so far interesting. As mentioned earlier, it's not a necessity to look offshore to identify trends in our own regions. However, it can provide us with a longer lens and allow us to make better judgments on what we need to do to adapt within an evolving market. We've discussed the importance of observing skills within occupations to provide a refined version of what's happening within those roles and understand them in a more meaningful way. We've seen global evolution in the appreciation of this viewpoint, with governments globally moving towards a skill-based landscape to further their economies and social welfare. Applying Lightcast data, we've observed the skill changes over time in 2 occupations and have seen notable trends that reinforce the changing nature of occupational skills over time, which allows us to make better decisions as educators, employers, and workers. We observed demand change in project management, cloud and programming skills with the occupation of software engineer, and clear demand changes in baseline specialized and software skills for graphic designers. We've also observed a burgeoning global emphasis on sustainability and environmental responsibility, leading to an increased demand for green skills. Governments are recognizing the shift in skill requirement and producing strategies to promote a transition to a more sustainable economy. Lightcast data and research is shining a light on these changes, and in this webinar, we looked at green skill demand over time from a wide lens in 3 geographies and a narrow lens with climate change skills, and see that labour market data reflects the growing demand in multiple regions. If you found this topic interesting and you'd like to find out more, you might find the following resources valuable. We're going to circulate these resources following the presentation today and the slides from today in a follow-up email, so look out for those. And I think, Daniel, we might have received a couple of questions, so while we've got some time, we might just broach a couple of those. Are you there, Daniel?
Yes, hi, thanks, Ben. Really great to hear more about how international trends are a lead indicator for the local markets. We've had a few questions in, and there's always more time for a couple of extras. So if you do have ones, please put them into the question box or the chat as part of the webinar. Firstly, look, you've used lots of ANZ data and US and UK. How are these trends reflected in Singapore?
It's a great question. So, yeah, we did discuss that. We actually chose ANZ data for this webinar as it incorporates 2 countries, obviously, with Australia and New Zealand, and offers some good intelligence to a large portion of clients in region. However, we love our many clients in Singapore and have actually talked about extending this data research to incorporate Singaporean data as well. So if there's anybody here today who would like to see some of these presented with that data in mind, I'm more than happy to do that work and send it through to you as well. So just get in touch offline. You'll find our details come through in the following email after this presentation as well.
Excellent, thank you. Another question that came in was, look, for graphic designers, you focused a lot on the Adobe suite, but you mentioned that some of those other software skills are creeping up. Sorry, just reading through the question. What are those, and can you describe some of those changes and shifts, please?
Yeah, it's a good question. Excuse me. It's certainly something we're interested in observing also. So as I mentioned in the presentation, it's sort of, there's a question there as to whether it's a sort of natural decline in popularity, or whether it's actually reaching the point where genuine competitors are coming into the market, because the Adobe suite's been such a dominant force over the last few years. We know that a number of less enterprise scale solutions are becoming popular. We're getting a lot of SaaS models, like Canva, for example, Corel, and there's even open source tools like GIMP. I think Pixel is open source as well. So I would imagine that as more SaaS options like Canva and the open source products like GIMP attract more users and companies, that slow decline of demand for Adobe products will continue, but I think it's probably unlikely to fall too far off the radar as well. So I would love to, following the work we did with this presentation, actually start to dig a little deeper into those alternative solutions to the Adobe suite. So look out for that. You might see it in a following webinar.
It sounds like you're volunteering there, Ben. Excellent. The question as well is, we covered 2 occupations here, but is there a way that users of Labour Insight and similar tools can replicate similar analysis for different job types?
Do you mean on a global, does the question suggest whether that's on a global?
Both locally and globally.
Yeah, so domestically, yes, we can absolutely see these trends within Labour Insight. If you're not familiar with how to do that, I'd say jump into either Daniel or my Calendly links and put some time in the calendar. We'd be more than happy to show how we can emulate this on a domestic viewpoint. I think from a global perspective, obviously you don't have access to, say, UK or US data via Labour Insight, but we do have software that can attract the data in those regions as well. So if you are interested, we'd love to have that conversation, just show you. I mean, I've obviously been working through this data from different geographies over the last few weeks preparing for this presentation, so I'm relatively well versed with it. So yes, if you'd like to see how I've gone about that in the background, I'd be delighted to walk you through it.
Nice, thanks. Another question, and I think we'll have one more or 2 more, and then we'll call it. So please type them in if you've got a burning question to ask. Look, ChatGPT, there's been lots of discussion around this. Do you think that a similar approach to what you've used could help people understand the impact of generative AI on their local markets?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I mean, it's something, Daniel, you and I have spent a little bit of time looking into, and it's definitely obviously a hot topic at the moment, the impact of AI. So yes, we have skills related to AI within our taxonomies, so that allows us to look at labour market demands and trends via that lens as well. I think certainly it would be fascinating to look at it from a global scale to see where it's emerging from. So yeah, absolutely, that is something we can do. I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add to that, Daniel, actually.
No, the answer is certainly yes. We can certainly start tracking these things. And we're certainly starting to see some of these trends emerge in the US, and will be interesting to see how they play out in Australia. My assumption here would be it'll be a bit faster than the 2 to 4 year lag we generally see with these things occurring. And that takes me to my final question, which I asked it in the chat prematurely, but I'll ask publicly as well. Is, do you find that as a general assumption, the APAC data and trends lag the US by about 2 years, more generally?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, this research today probably suggests that's the case. To be fair, we've gone in relatively narrow in terms of occupation, so I think we could probably broaden that and see whether it's a wider trend than just in the specific occupations that we've looked at. But look, it's definitely pretty clear, because it seems to happen more often than not when we're going through this sort of research, that yes, particularly I would say in fields where the US kind of leads the way. So software development's a great example, you know, with Silicon Valley and the technology that tends to come out of the US with their scale. I think there's acceleration there, and we tend to then sort of see that and start to emulate it onshore as well. I like to think we're pretty forward thinking in the APAC region. So I think that's probably the only thing that might disrupt that, is I think there's certain areas where Kiwis, Australians, Singaporeans, etc., have the ability and agility to probably think a little bit outside of the box, and that's why we tend to see quite a lot of technology development here as well. So I wouldn't know concretely without looking more closely at the data, but I would say yes, there is generally a pretty strong trend that you're seeing. Any trends you're observing offshore in the bigger countries like the US, you're probably likely to experience domestically at some stage.
Nice, and that is all the questions we've had in. So over to you for a final word, Ben.
Well, thank you very much. I will keep it short and sweet. I just want to thank everybody for your attendance today. We realize this is taking some time out of your day, so I really do hope you found some value. If anything, hopefully it's just stirred up some thoughts that you might like to continue with Daniel and I. So please don't be shy. All our details, if you don't have them already, will be coming through in the follow-up email. But again, really hope you found this webinar somewhat insightful, and look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Have a great rest of the week.